Picture a Lada Riva parked outside a pub in Britain, sometime in the late 1980s. Someone inside is bound to have something to say about it. To British eyes, it was an old, cheap, sluggish car, the kind of thing you bought when your bank balance made the decision for you. But judging the Riva that way is a bit like watching a movie and missing the opening act. You only see the ending, and that ending doesn't do justice to the whole story. For millions of Soviet citizens, this car, known back home as the Zhiguli, was the first automobile they ever owned. Over more than 40 years on the market, it outsold even the Ford Model T. This wasn't just a cheap car. It was a symbol of something people had been longing for in a society where owning your own car was never easy. So how did a car that got laughed at in the West become something people in the Soviet Union dreamed about? And why, of all places, did the Soviets push so hard to sell it in Britain throughout the 1980s? After World War II, personal transportation exploded across the West. It started with motorcycles, then quickly shifted to full cars, and car ownership kept climbing year after year. The Soviets took notice, and they came to a conclusion. If ordinary people had their own cars, the economy could grow faster, and citizens would be happier with the system running things. The problem was, what the Soviets already had wasn't good enough. The ZA-965 had launched, but it was small, weak, and nobody got excited about it. The country needed something bigger, more practical, something that actually deserved to be called a people's car. In 1964, the Soviets started looking for a foreign partner. They sat down with Volkswagen, with Renault, and with Fiat. Some people inside the system leaned toward the Renault 16. But Fiat ended up winning, for three reasons combined. Fiat was more willing to cooperate than anyone else. Italy had a government friendly to socialism at the time, and Fiat was already used to producing cars at a massive scale, 600,000 a year. The platform chosen was the Fiat 124, designed by Oscar Montalbano. It launched in a fairly dramatic way, parachuted out of the sky for its public unveiling. Underneath a body that's been described as 3 cardboard boxes stuck together was a chassis that was actually pretty modern for its time, with a fully synchronized gearbox, coil springs in the rear instead of leaf springs, and disc brakes on all 4 wheels. In 1967, the Fiat 124 won Car of the Year. In August 1966, the agreement between Fiat and the Soviet Union was signed. Initially, the Soviets had their eye on the larger Fiat 125, but the 125 was built on older technology dating back to 1961, so it got dropped. The Fiat 124 became the more practical choice. The Soviets picked a site on the banks of the Volga River at Stavropol to build a massive new factory. The city itself had already been relocated once, back in the 1950s, after a dam and hydroelectric plant were built there. Now it was renamed Togliatti, after Palmiro Togliatti, the longest-serving General Secretary of the Italian Communist Party, a man who'd played a key role in bringing Fiat and the Soviets together. The new plant was called the Volga Automobile Plant, or in Russian, Volgyskyi Avtomobilny Zavod, shortened to VAZ. Thousands of Russian workers moved to the city to build it. Fiat helped design the car, helped set up the production line, and brought in new automation tools, treating the whole thing as a dry run to catch problems before mass production began. In the summer of 1966, test runs near Moscow made one thing very clear. The Fiat 124 was not ready for the Soviet Union. The chassis on some test cars cracked. Fiat sent over new cars with reinforced frames, but those cracked too. Come winter, the rear disc brakes got clogged with salt and grit from icy roads and only lasted a few hundred miles, somewhere around 250 to 500 miles. The rubber bushings in the front suspension failed as well. Vaz had no choice but to dig in and rework the car from the ground up. The chassis was built from thicker steel, reinforced in the areas that took the most stress. The suspension was raised and softened to handle rural Soviet roads. A tow hook was added so the car could pull itself out of trouble or help tow another vehicle. The rear disc brakes were dropped entirely in favor of aluminum drum brakes, better suited to freezing winters. The earliest cars even came with a hand crank starter, just in case the battery died in the middle of a Siberian winter. The Fiat 124's original 1.2-liter engine was seen as too weak and already outdated, so it was reworked with an overhead camshaft. The transmission and clutch were also beefed up to handle rougher driving conditions. By the time it rolled out of Togliatti, the car barely resembled the original Fiat 124 in terms of durability. The roads, the winters, and the practical demands of Soviet life had completely reshaped it. The car was now tough enough to survive in the Soviet Union, but the factory still had another problem to solve. Could they actually build enough of them fast enough for the millions of people waiting? The answer to that question came in 1970. The car rolling off the line was named the Zhiguli after the hills near the factory. That April, Henry Ford II visited the Togliatti plant just before the first car officially went into production. Output ramped up gradually at first. By the end of 1970, 22,000 cars had been built. By the summer of 1971, the 100,000th car rolled off the line. The plant quickly became the gold standard for Soviet factories and picked up plenty of awards along the way. The lineup expanded from there. In 1972, an estate version of the Zhiguli arrived. A deluxe model based on the Fiat 124S also launched. Some versions got a larger 1.5-liter engine. The Zhiguli quickly became the car Soviet citizens wanted most. Even once the factory hit a capacity of 660,000 cars a year, waiting lists stayed long, and buyers could end up waiting years before getting one. Eventually, VAZ was producing as many as 750,000 cars annually, making it the third most productive car plant in the world. But the waiting list in the Soviet Union still stretched past a year. Cars like the Gaz or ZIL might have been better built, but those were reserved for party members and government officials, completely out of reach for ordinary citizens. The Zhiguli was the most realistic thing a regular person could hope for. At home, this was a story about a car people had to wait years to get their hands on. While Soviet citizens lined up for a Zhiguli, the state saw something completely different in this car. The Soviet economy was largely cut off from the rest of the world, but it still needed to buy certain things from the West, and buying things required hard currency. The Politburo was always on the lookout for products the West might actually be willing to pay for, and this little car turned out to be a candidate. There was one problem. The name Zhiguli didn't work for Western markets. It was hard to pronounce, and to some Spanish speakers, it sounded a bit too close to gigolo. In 1973, VAZ switched to the name Lada, much easier to say, for export markets. In 1974, a major opportunity opened up when Fiat discontinued the Fiat 124. V's could step into that gap with a car that was nearly identical. The one exception was Italy, since the agreement with Fiat specifically blocked that market. Saloon and estate versions began showing up across Europe under the names Lada 1 200 and 2101. The Fiat 124 had originally been designed for both left-hand and right-hand drive, which meant Lada could sell it almost anywhere in the world without major changes. In Britain, it all came down to one number, and that was the price. In May 1974, the first shipment of Lada 1200s for the British market arrived at Carnaby Industrial Estate, priced at £980 and 83 pence. Adjusted for today, that's roughly £12,000, 15,000 US dollars, 13,000 euros, or 21,000 Australian dollars. For that price, buyers got something close to a Fiat 124, but reinforced to handle some of the harshest conditions on the planet, and a design that was still only about 7 years old. By this point, Viaz had built 4 million cars, and export revenue helped the company buy new technology to push production even higher. The Zhiguli was also exported to Canada under the name Lada Signet. Export earnings helped Viaz purchase 30 welding robots from Japan, installed between 1977 and 1981. As output increased, the waiting list back in the Soviet Union shrank to roughly a year. Lada had found its export formula: cheap, easy to sell, durable enough. But heading into the 1980s, that formula ran into a new problem. In the West, the car was starting to look more and more dated. Looking dated didn't mean Vaz was sitting still. The Zhiguli got updated repeatedly throughout the 1970s, though never with a complete overhaul. In 1974, the engine grew to 1.3 litres, the seats got more comfortable, and the interior and exterior received minor refreshes. In 1976, the Zhiguli became the 2106, sold abroad as the Lada 1600. Its 1.6-litre engine came from boring out the block and lengthening the piston stroke. Power didn't increase much over the 1.5-litre version, but torque went up considerably. Expensive chrome trim got swapped for cheaper materials, mirroring a trend Western automakers were following at the time too. The upper trim level added headrests to the front seats. The overall shape stayed nearly identical, partly to preserve the spirit of the original Fiat design, and partly because a major redesign would have cost too much. An interesting technical side branch developed alongside the main lineup. In 1974, what remained of NSU granted VAZ the rights to use the Wankel rotary engine. Production began in 1976, and by 1978, rotary-powered versions of the Zhiguli started appearing, reserved exclusively for Soviet police and the KGB. Later on, a twin-rotor version reached 140 horsepower, with a 0 to 60 miles per hour time of around 9 seconds. VAZ kept producing rotary engines until 2004, though always on a small scale, nothing close to the mass production Mazda achieved with its own rotary engines. In 1979, the Zhiguli received another round of small updates, mostly aimed at cutting production costs. The rear lights, for example, got combined into a single unit. A few genuine improvements showed up too, like cloth seats. 4 years later, this version arrived in Western Europe as the Lada Riva, initially only as a 1.3-litre saloon, with 1.2-litre and 1.5-litre options added the following year. In Britain, Lada poured money into advertising to grow market share. In 1982, the car took part in the Lada Challenge Trophy, and that same year, Lada sponsored the snooker tournament known as the Classic. At that event, Steve Davis scored the first televised maximum break in snooker history and won a Lada Riva as the prize. To British buyers, the Riva became something both practical and a bit of a joke. People bought it for all kinds of reasons, some out of sympathy for Soviet ideals, others simply because it was a bargain, cheap to run, easy to maintain, and had that distinctive retro look. Lada added a 5-speed gearbox and introduced the SLX trim with a few minor cosmetic differences. But anything with Soviet origins was increasingly seen as outdated, and the Riva got lumped in with cars like the Skoda and the Yugo, becoming a regular punchline. None of those jokes slowed down sales. The Riva kept selling steadily, and it was about to hit the highest point in its entire sales history in Britain. That peak came in 1988, but before getting there, Vaz had quietly been working on a brand new model to eventually replace the Riva. The Samara launched in the Soviet Union in 1984 and reached Britain in 1987. The Samara was already priced low compared to its Western rivals, but the Riva stuck around on the market anyway, positioned below the Samara as an even cheaper option. That's exactly what kept the Riva relevant, even with a design that was already over a decade old. In 1988, Lada sales in Britain hit their peak, 30,000 units sold, up from 20,000 just 2 years earlier. This was also a moment when the Soviet Union needed hard currency more than ever, as the Soviet economy started showing serious signs of strain. The Riva's reach extended well beyond Europe too. In New Zealand, it was sold through a rather unusual deal with the New Zealand Dairy Board, where the Soviets received mutton and butter in exchange and New Zealanders got Rivas. Plenty of those cars ended up working as taxis. Once the Soviet Union collapsed and the Russian market started opening up, the Riva began losing the very advantage that had kept it alive for so long. In 1992, the Riva gained fuel injection and a catalytic converter to meet new emissions regulations in Western Europe. Beyond that, the car stayed largely the same. In 1995, Lada celebrated reaching 1/3 cars sold in Britain. After that, the Riva entered a clear decline. More and more buyers chose the Samara instead. Western cars were also becoming more common in Russia, at least among people who could afford them. By the late 1990s, Russia's economy fell into crisis, and Vaz struggled to source the parts it needed to keep building cars. In Britain, the Samara finished dead last in J.D. Power surveys for both 1996 and 1997. Lada quietly exited the British market. Back in Russia, the Zhiguli remained one of the cheapest cars you could buy, and Vaz started using the Lada name for its home market as well, where the car still held a solid position. Lada was gone from Britain, but in Russia and elsewhere around the world, this car's journey wasn't over yet. In 2001, VAZ signed a joint venture with General Motors. By 2008, a more stable future arrived with Renault, which eventually took a controlling stake in this post-Soviet company. Zhiguli production in Russia came to an end as VAZ shifted its focus to newer Lada models. Production officially stopped in 2010 after 40 years, with total output reaching 17.75 million cars. Russian affection for this car runs deep. In 2000, the magazine Zarulem held a vote for the best domestic car of the 20th century, and the Zhiguli won by a landslide. It's still common on the used car market today. Like the Beetle, you can find Zhigulis in places far removed from the old Soviet Union, from Brazil to Cuba to Angola. Production in Egypt began in 2002 and ran until 2015, nearly 50 years after Fiat first started building the 124. That was the final stop for a design that had crossed more countries, more political systems, and more decades than anyone in Turin could have imagined. When Oscar Montalbán drew up those first lines for the Fiat 124, he created a simple, boxy, solidly built Italian design. The Soviets took that design, reinforced it to survive some of the harshest conditions on Earth, and turned it into the first car for millions of families, a tool for earning foreign currency for the state, and ultimately one of the longest-running car designs in the history of the industry. So, was the Lada Riva really just a bad car that the West loved to mock? Or was it actually one of the most successful practical cars of the 20th century? Drop a comment and let us know what you think. And if you enjoy stories like this one, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next video.